All right, we left off with just a couple things untouched from chapter 28. I want to touch on the narrative point of view and why this is a significant factor and how it fits into the theme and the symbol and all of that. So, narrative point of view is kind of broken down into four different categories. You can have a first person point of view, which is obviously when the author is saying, I think this, I think that. You see it from one person's point of view or perspective. Um, this character is in the story. He's relating his or her experiences directly to the reader. Obviously, that's what To Kill a Mockingbird is written in, because it's told from Scout's perspective. Whereas other stories that we have read, so of Mice and Men, for instance, are told from different points of view because we don't have it told from Lenny's perspective or George's perspective, etc. So let's look at the others. The second person point of view is told to you. This is not a common point of view used in fiction, but again, it's still good to know. So sometimes I'm trying to think if there's a literature book that you might have read in second person. I don't think so. This might be more like your journal entries where you're saying, and some of you write in second person, interestingly enough, when you write to me. So you say, you address me specifically, like a letter. A letter is a second person point of view. Okay, third person point of view. There are kind of two different third persons. One is limited and one is omniscient. Limited is about he or she. This is the most common point of view used in fiction. The narrator is outside of the story and they're telling the experiences that the character has. The limited aspect means that the narrator is removed from the internal workings, processes, and thoughts of the characters. So for instance, the narrator is not able to go inside of the head of its characters and try to understand what they're thinking. So for Of Mice and Men, do we ever know what Lenny is thinking? Not particularly. We don't know what his thoughts look like, nor do we really know what George's thoughts look like unless he or either of the characters express those thoughts verbally. Whereas an omniscient narrator is still about he or she, but the narrator has full access to the thoughts and experiences of every character in the story. And so that would be sort of the third person omniscient point of view, which is the same term we use for God, that it's like the godlike perspective, that you get to see the intricate details of everyone. And so with Scout, we have a first person point of view, and I added the word limited because it is a limited point of view, as we've talked about the entire time. And this is how her costume is very symbolic of that point of view, because this is how we're seeing the story. She's peeking out, trying to help us understand the complexity that is life in the 1930s Depression era, fully segregated, absolutely rife with prejudice. And so it's fully an accurate representation, which is why Scout's ham costume is so iconic. I kind of make this point lightly. You can have a Scout in a ham costume water bottle, or even leggings, or a journal, or a bag, or a little wooden figurine. But for all intents and purposes, why is this so iconic? Why is it that people would want to sort of memorialize? Because this is the story in a nutshell. Now, the producers of this merchandise probably don't quite understand the complexity of the story, but when you look at this image, it helps you to understand this is childhood right here. This is innocence. This is the beauty of being sheltered from the world and all of its ugliness. And so it's a beautiful and hopeful symbol that the children are the ones who preserve like the beauty and the goodness in and the light in the midst of a dark world. Moving into the next chapter, I like this student presentation of chapter 29, so we're going to look through this briefly. With chapter 29, it is the aftermath of the near fatal attack on the children. They go back to the Finch's house. Hecate, the sheriff, also comes and he informs the Finches that Yule is dead. He found him under a tree, and Dr. Reynolds and Heck are tending to Jem while Scout explains what she remembers happening. The sheriff he asks Scout if she knows who saved them, and she finally realizes that it was Boo Radley. You have to read that to figure out how she kind of puts those clues together. So you have Jem and Scout, and Jem is laying in bed and he is unconscious. Dr. Reynolds and Hecate care for him. They say he's going to be okay, but he just has a broken arm and it's like thoroughly broken. Scout relays what occurred that night the best she could, and Hecate confirms Bob Buell's death. Scout finally gets to meet Boo Radley at the very end of the chapter. She says, "Hey, Boo," and then the chapter ends. Significant quotes, Mr. Finch. There's just some men you have to shoot before you can say hi to them, and even then they ain't worth the bullet it takes to shoot them. Ewell, he was one of them. And so it's a significant quote because what do you guys think about that? Do you think that it is accurate that some people just aren't worth kindness, that there isn't a potential for them to turn around, to be redeemed, and that really they're just better off either dead, as this says, or in prison? Or do you think that there is inherent goodness in everyone? And that's kind of what this quote explores. Secondly, when I pointed to him, his palm slipped slightly, leaving greasy, sweaty streaks on the wall, and he hooked his thumbs in his belt, and a strange small spasm shook him, as if he heard fingernails scrape slate. But as I gazed at him in wonder, the tension slowly drained from his face. His lips parted into a timid smile, and our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. "Hey, Boo," I said. And so she was willing, these are some of the clues that helped her to understand kind of who he was. Just that he was pale, he never saw the sun, everything was just kind of thin and gaunt, as if his limbs had not been exercised. He was nervous, sweaty, and uncomfortable. He just kind of stood in the shadows of the room, forgotten. So I wanted to point out with this section, and in preparation for your homework, that these chapters are really strong with regard to allusion. There are biblical allusions as well as literary allusions. And so let me zoom in on this for a second. So you guys are going to have some questions that help you analyze the allusions in the text. So for one, Hecate says, "There's a black boy dead for no reason. The man's responsible for its dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead." This goes along with sort of that biblical claim that Jesus dispels, in fact, that the eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. And this was an old Levitical principle that Jesus says, no, it shouldn't be that. Like, and that's when he talks about like above and beyond generosity that extends grace even to those who don't deserve grace. And so in this instance, it's a biblical reference said a little bit differently, but it brings up that question of what's the right answer? Is it okay for Mr. Yule's life to be taken because he took the life, in theory, of Tom Robinson, and he intended to take the lives of Jen and Scout? Do we call that justice? Or is there more to it? Is justice something that is filled with grace? And then what's the difference? How would the world see that versus how Christ would see that? And so I want you to spend some time analyzing that concept and comparison. There are three more allusions or recollections. So allusion can be a reference to another literary work, or it can even be to something that already happened in the text. So there's 3 allusions that we're going to look at. And so one, Scout describes her attack, that he choked and strangled her. That's an allusion to the description of how Mayella was beaten in chapter 18. What are the similarities, and what does that seem to suggest about the character of Bob Ewell? Number 2, the second allusion, is what details in the description of the stranger that saved Jem and Scout give her clues to his identity. So who does she realize that he is, and what would lead her to believe that he is Boo Radley? This goes back to ways that he was described by the children and by neighbors as a recluse, as somebody who is kind of how it goes back to how the kids misconstrued the facts that the neighborhood stated about Boo Radley. And so go back and look at those comparisons to see how the clues given that we just read, where was that? Are allusions to other quotes about Boo Radley. There we go. It's right here. So where do we see a reference to his fingernails scraping? That's in chapter 3, I believe, or maybe 2. Where do you see the allusion with him kind of having spasms? And where do you see sort of his reclusive tendencies alluded to earlier in the chapter? And then the final allusion, what does Scout say that lets her father know that she understands the truth of what happened? She talks about a mockingbird. A mockingbird is referenced, I think, 4 times in the book. So it's a callback to those to help us understand that she is growing and maturing through these. So those are literary allusions that I hope you understand that concept, because it's key in governing decoding some of the events of the chapters. And then we're going to end this section by looking at 2 student projects. Let's see if I can make them larger. Okay, I might save that for another video. So go ahead and read at this point, if you haven't already, chapters 29 and 30, so that you can get some of the details down about the plot and how it's progressing. Try to take note of the character growth, also of the literary details that we've discussed. And then we're going to conclude in the last 2 chapters by looking at the conflict with regard to the agenda of equity that seems to be completely violated at the end of the text. So that'll make more sense with the next one.